something you need to see. Again, we're going to look at the 3 reasons why in just a minute. I wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from John MacArthur's sermon on this because, quite frankly, I was trying to put this into my own words, and as I was listening and reading this, I'm going, he just simply lays it out much better than I ever could. Okay, and so I don't normally do this, but I'm going to borrow word for word a couple of paragraphs from MacArthur because God revealing himself in this sort of a way is nothing new. God coming to his people in the form of light, in the form of clouds, and revealing his majesty and his glory, it's nothing new. It had been 400 years or centuries before God had done anything like this. We remember between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, there had been about 400 years, and so they call them the silent years. There wasn't a lot of prophets being raised up and a lot of God coming in power like this. But I want to briefly go through some of the Old Testament accounts of how, of how God comes to his people and reveals himself in these sorts of ways as Jesus does here. So let's just do it this way. These are Jewish men. Peter and James and John, devout Jews, know the Old Testament, committed to the Old Testament, love the Old Testament, and are looking for their Messiah. They know God has appeared in the Old Testament. He appeared, he revealed himself in visible form, and it was always or almost always in some kind of light. A cloud, a light in a cloud, an iridescent cloud, fire, the Shekinah glory. The appearances of God were light phenomena. At the intention of the priestly service in Leviticus chapter 9, God appears in light. In Exodus verses 7 to 10, God appears to Israel as light. In Exodus 24, God appears to Moses as light. In Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 and 35, the tabernacle is completed, and God appears in the Shekinah glory as light. At Kadesh Barnea, you remember in Numbers chapter 14, where the children of Israel rebelled against God, God appears in light. A couple of chapters later, in the 16th chapter of Numbers, at the exposure of the sins of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, God again appears as light. Numbers 16, the same chapter, at the rebellion of Israel against Moses and Aaron, God appears. In Numbers chapter 20, God appears as light at Meribah when Israel was thirsty. And then when the temple was completed, it was recorded in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 8 through 11, the glory of God descended on the place. And God was there in his blazing glory. In 2 Chronicles 7:1, when the first offering was made in the temple. Every one of those was an appearance of God in light, God reducing his nature to a visible light phenomenon, unearthly, supernatural, incomparable. Habakkuk the prophet sees a future day of full glory when, quote, the earth shall, and this is going to happen one of these days, guys, by the way. We're still looking for this day. Christ fills in a lot of this. We're looking at in a second. But Habakkuk looks to a day that we're all still looking to. The earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. I love being committed and dedicated to the glory of God because that is what is going to illuminate the new earth. There will be a time in the glorious millennial kingdom of Christ when somehow his glory will literally cover the planet. Until then, all the revelations of God's glory are somewhat partial and somewhat limited. You remember what God said to Moses. It was funny, Lori was watching a Beth Moore video and she hinted at some of this also, and I was going, man, I just read about that, and it's really powerful. God said to Moses, no man can see my face and live. Exodus 33. So I'll show you my back parts. Moses said, if you don't show me your glory, I'm not going to lead this people. God says, I'll show you my back parts. Tucked him in a rock and gave him a small glimpse of his glory because the full glory would have consumed him. So when Peter, James, and John are up on this mountain with Jesus, and they suddenly, one of the other Gospels says they were sleeping, maybe because they were depressed, like in the Garden of Gethsemane, they were sleeping. I'm sure they were depressed. Sometimes that'll just put you right to sleep if you're struggling with depression. It'll make you real tired. I don't know for sure in this case, but the disciples were sleeping. The Bible says they went up there to pray. As Jesus was praying, boom, this happens. The glory of Christ comes. The glory of God comes. There is nothing but radiant light filling this entire place. Elijah and Moses appear in their glorified bodies. They were glorified, talking with Jesus. I am sure some, if not all, of these Old Testament passages start flooding in to Peter and James and John's minds. Oh, I read about that. Moses talked about that. Habakkuk talked about that. Different parts of the Old Testament talk about this, and we're seeing this right now. The first reason Jesus leads Peter and James and John to this mountain is to show them his glory. Guys, we need to be committed to the glory of Christ. We need to be driven. That's the one thing I love about John Piper the most. Second on there is his passion, but the first thing is his hammering home of that truth. We exist to bring God glory, and in that we find joy. If you don't have joy, let God be glorified in your life. That is where your joy is hiding. And you're going to hear that over and over and over again. The first reason why Jesus leads Peter and James and John, I've got to show you guys something. There's something you need to see. Verses 2 and 3 again. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. 2 Corinthians talks about the glory of God shining in the face of Christ. The glory of God shines in the face of Christ. All of God's attributes contained in him, because he is fully God. He is called the Lord of glory. Up until this point, guys, Christ came into human history, left his throne in heaven, comes into human history not in radiant clothes, not with a king's crown on his head, not born of royalty, but he comes as a humble, marginalized Galilean peasant. Homeless, obscure, normal, nothing special about him, the Bible says. There was nothing about him that would make people think anything special about him. He comes into human history born to a poor Jewish carpenter. Jesus, for 30 years, carried a lunchbox to work. Humble, obscure. And he pulls, when the time was right, it starts his ministry, is already getting towards the end of his ministry, has his 3 guys, Peter, James, and John, and says, guys, there's something I've got to show you. There's something you need to see about it. I am no marginalized, humble, poor, homeless Galilean peasant. I am the King of Kings. I am the Lord of Lords. This is the same image you see of Christ in Revelation, the Lamb that was slain in radiant clothes, with swords coming out of his mouth, with fire in his eyes. This is who I am. This is who you need to see. I emptied myself when I came into human history so I could die for the sins of the world. But you need to know something, that one of these days every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, because I am King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Before me there is no other. I am God. I am no peasant. I've humbled myself. I've come into human history. But before Abraham was, I am. And Moses saw my glory in the crack of this rock. He just saw a glimpse of my glory. And now you're looking at the face of the glory of God when you look at me. If you have seen me, you've seen the Father. And I am King of Kings, and I am Lord of Lords. I am no Jewish peasant. One of these days, all the things that Habakkuk talked about, all the things that the Old Testament prophets talked about, ruling this earth from his throne, that is me. I'm not just a prophet. I'm not just a teacher. I'm not just a carpenter. I am King, victorious King of kings and Lord of lords. This is the image that we see of Christ in the book of Revelation. And friends, this is the Jesus that you will stand before one of these days. You see, in our culture, we like to paint Jesus as Mr. Rogers with a beard, a gay hippie that likes to have pithy little sayings, a limp-wristed sky fairy. You watch some of the cartoons and the TV shows and even some of the well-intentioned movies that have been made of Jesus as this feathered-haired, Brad Pitt-looking Mother Teresa with a beard. But I am telling you, you are going to stand before the transfigured Jesus one of these days. King of kings and Lord of lords. And you need to know that. And your friends and your family and your neighbors and everybody that you come in contact with. The Bible says that at the end of time, he is going to line everybody in front of him. And if you end up at the great white throne judgment, you've got no one to blame but yourself. After hearing what you're hearing this morning, you've got no one to blame but yourself. And if you belong to Jesus, you're going to be with the sheep. And if you don't belong to Jesus, you're going to be put over here with the goats. And you will be judged. Jesus Christ is your judge. People in our culture, well, I don't like to be judged. I am not your judge. You come, we'll love on you. I don't care what your problems are, but I love you enough to tell you, Jesus is going to judge you. And you will be declared one of two things: innocent by the blood of the Lamb, or guilty of treason and rebellion against God. This is the Jesus that you will stand before. My friends, Jesus came into human history 2,000 years ago, and he will never take another beating. He will never have his beard ripped out of his face again. He will never be smacked and blindfolded again. He will never have a crown of thorns put on his head again. He will never have a spear or a sword stabbed in his side again. He will never go to another cross. He will never be mocked. He will never be spit upon. He will never be punched. He will never be betrayed again. That was a one-time deal. And we better surrender to him while he may be found. This is who Jesus is. And he's showing Peter and James and John, this is who you're dealing with. This is who you're dealing with. This, when you take my gospel to the ends of the earth, you remember this. First reason, and always the most important reason, Jesus wants us to be aware of his glory. And if you love him, you are commissioned to go and share the glory of God and be a beacon for the glory of God on this planet. That's what you're here for. First reason, unveil. For a brief moment, Jesus unveils. You guys, those of you that have been married, do you remember your bride, how she was veiled as she came down the altar, and then the veil was taken in. Wow. Those of you that aren't married yet, that's gonna take your breath away one of these days. In fact, the next time you're at a